Hello, I'm Hannah Whittingham, and welcome to the Ambulance Podcast, a series where we dive into the experiences of paramedics on the road, in the hub, and in the training room. In each episode, covering topics from breaking bad news to emotional resilience to diversity within the service, I'll be chatting with two guests, one who will share their story and often hard-won wisdom, and another who will join us to chat it all through on our comfortable crew room sofa. Today, we're discussing mental well-being in the workplace, whether that's taking care of day-to-day mental health or dealing with a particularly difficult or traumatic job. For this, I'll be chatting to Nathan Wilson, paramedic and learning development officer, and Steve Knowles, also a paramedic and learning development officer. As a trigger warning to our listeners, this episode does deal with sensitive issues around suicide and PTSD, so do listen with care. And as always, if you're affected by any of the issues discussed in this episode, you can find links to help, including charities and helplines, in the show notes accompanying this podcast. Our first guest is Nathan Wilson. Nathan trained as a frontline paramedic and now works as a learning development officer, primarily training new emergency care assistants, and is involved with several community projects around mental health. Joining him is Steve Knowles, also a paramedic, who took a brief trip into management, but quickly returned to the front line where he has remained and now also works as a learning development officer. So, Nathan, working as a frontline paramedic, it's quite likely that you're going to be called to jobs that are going to be really difficult to deal with, some much more so than others. But you had a particular job that affected you quite profoundly. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course, Hannah. And it was, a very difficult day. I think there was a number of things that happened throughout the day that led to it affecting me so profoundly. But I was working on a rapid response vehicle and a call came through to a child who was in cardiac arrest. And instantly, as soon as that happened, the heart rate rose and sort of that impending sense of fear, I suppose, that this is that challenging job. And I distinctly remember on the radio, it stays with me, that I said, Roger, all received, I'll make some progress. And I did. I think it's the first and probably only time I've experienced red mist whilst driving on emergency lights. And en route to that job, I had a very near car accident that I hit a humpback bridge quite fast and proper Dukes of Hazzard style. Went over the bridge and took a bit of a slide at the end of it. So instantly I was sort of in this heightened state. Arrived on scene. And there was pandemonium. There was lots of emotions flying around. And the child was in cardiac arrest. There were other healthcare professionals on scene that were performing basic life support. And I went to take over with that support and very quickly on scene realised that it was a futile attempt. The child had suicided, for want of a better word, trying to avoid the word saying commit. And it was clear that we were too late as an emergency service. But with all the fear and not knowing what to do in this situation, I carried on performing basic life support to the best that I could, called for backup and support, which did arrive, but it seemed to take an eternity. I couldn't estimate how long it did take to arrive, but when they did, they were really supportive. We carried on, and we did receive some support from it was either critical care or a nearby doctor that was working at the time, who eventually took that decision to call it, pronounce the child dead at scene. At which point, I kind of removed myself from the scene. Because of the emotions involved personally, and obviously relatives on scene. The job then went on for some hours afterwards. We still conveyed to the nearest emergency department, as is routine with all child deaths. And then after the job, I went back home. I was currently staying in some accommodation, and I'd been burgled whilst I was on shift. So I lost my iPhone and money, and even worse than that, someone had slept in my bed. The lodgings I was in was on a hospital site, and I'd left the window open and someone had taken the opportunity to pop in, steal my things and have a sleep in my bed.
Well, that sounds like quite a shift. Thank you for sharing that. It sounds like your training kicked in and you did everything you needed to do in the moment. Can you remember how you felt at the time? Did you have a sense that this was going to be as sort of significant to you in an ongoing way as it actually was, or was it just 100% in the job as you were doing it?
Yeah, completely immersed in the job itself when I was there. And yeah, there was certainly no sort of feeling that this would stay with me for a long period of time. But yeah, the job itself, I think being there on my own was really challenging. And I think as a service, we're not doing as much lone working anymore. I worked by myself for 18 months on an RRV line. So I think lone working is definitely a big risk factor. And just the expectation on you as an individual in that scenario where there's that perceived life or death type decisions, and it's all put on you. And as soon as you arrive, everyone else on scene took that step backwards, and it's almost just a ring of eyes. It feels like, yeah, you have to perform. And I think, honestly, I would have been justified in not carrying out advanced life support based on the findings when we arrived. But that's not something that I could comfortably make on my own.
Yeah. And how about, I suppose, in terms of sort of how profoundly jobs can affect you? I imagine that the other sort of non-clinicians present at the time is probably going to have quite a big effect as well, whether it's you're just attending, whether it's just a patient, or whether they're a family, whether there are loads of people around.
Massively so. And that's where all the emotion comes from. Ultimately, there was nothing we could have done for the patient, but the grief that people were going through, and it was almost palpable, the emotion in the room. It was frantic and busy, and as well as having to try and do advanced life support as best you can on your own, there's also managing the scene and people, which is a challenge in itself.
Yeah, particularly when you're on your own and you've got no one else to delegate stuff to. What were the next few weeks for you like? When did you first have an inkling, I suppose, that this might have been something that affected you? When you have difficult jobs like that, did you have any contact from anyone at base? Was there any protocol in place just to check that you were okay in the short term, first of all, before we sort of get on to later down the line?
Yeah, definitely. There was. So after finding out that I'd been burgled, I had to wait for forensics to turn up and the whole police incident. By the time that was all done, I'd had enough and wanted to go home, which I think is a fair enough decision.
Yeah, very understandable, yes.
So I told my line manager I went home, and I was due a couple of days off afterwards anyway. And I came back after my planned rest days, and I did have a phone call from my line manager at the time that very much felt like I want to say box ticking exercise, in that it's obviously been flagged to them. And the wording was almost looking for a certain type of response, as in, you're okay, aren't you? And I was okay at the time, honestly. I'd been reflecting on it, but there was nothing unhealthy about that reflection. I think exposure to that kind of incident, you're going to have strong emotions afterwards. That would be normal. I'd be more worried if I didn't feel anything immediately. So yeah, there was a follow-up process, but in that couple of weeks afterwards, I just felt like I had to get back to work, back to it, and almost to distract myself from it.
How much time then elapsed before you realised that you'd actually been more affected by this than you thought?
Yeah, it was a reasonable length of time. I'd say probably approaching a year, and it was, just as I'm sure you're going to do before this podcast, that there was a trigger warning that came up on TV, that it contained content relating to suicide. And there was just this really uncomfortable knot in my stomach. My heart rate rose, and I could feel myself feeling really uncomfortable. And I just remember closing my eyes, thinking, I can't physically watch this. So yeah, that was my excuse to get up. I can't remember what excuse I made, but needing the loo or something along those lines. So that was my first kind of real moment that this has stayed with me.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about in your work? Were there any moments that made it clear to you that actually it was sort of feeding into what you were doing in an ongoing way?
Yeah, frequently. Obviously, we attend people with mental health conditions who've carried out self-injury and have thoughts of suicide regularly. And each and every time there was a little element of this sort of nervousness, uncomfortableness, and not wanting to deal with it. And if I could utilize my crewmate or someone else to try and mitigate my exposure to it, then I would. I'd almost sort of try and withdraw where possible.
Did anyone notice? Did your crewmates notice that that's what you were doing?
No, I wouldn't let them. I don't think. I'd say I invested a lot of time and energy into hiding it. Even my wife, who knows me very well, who I can be very open with, she didn't understand. So yeah, I mean, even I'm sure we'll talk about what I did later on, but yeah, sort of 7, 8 years down the line, she still wasn't aware. As a society, I don't think we're very good at asking those questions. That maybe people had picked up on that I wasn't myself, or at times, yeah, I'd had these sort of low moods. And I think they definitely picked up on those, but certainly not associated them with what I was going through, because I wouldn't talk about it and would avoid any situation where I felt like it might be discussed.
Yeah. So how did it eventually come to a head? You said it was a long time later, but what was the moment that you decided, actually, I think I do need some support for this?
So I think there were several attempts to get support prior, and went through our internal Staying Well service where I received some talking therapies, but they weren't specifically for the incident, because I'd always associated my low moods with a factor going on in my life at the time. So I was seeking help maybe for the wrong things. So I'd associate my low moods because my nan was unwell, or because work was busy, or there was always a logical, rational reason for it. So I went through Staying Well service several times before I discussed the symptoms of PTSD, I suppose, post-traumatic stress disorder, which 7 years down the line, I would wake up in cold sweats, reliving the incident in intricate details. And one of the things during the incident was that I messed up my intubation a little bit. I didn't know you couldn't get a size 7 tube over the top of a bougie and ending up in a bit of a tangle. And I'd recall very specific details at night often, but also during the day at times. There would be a discussion that would occur, and it would take me back, I think, physically and mentally to the incident. And they were increasing in frequency, which is the point I thought I cannot carry on reliving this event. So I did speak with Staying Well service specifically about those symptoms.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you went so long in and out of various sort of forms of therapy and you just never mentioned it.
And I think, honestly, I don't know if it was lying, but it was more I didn't truly understand it myself.
Yeah.
And I didn't have a grasp on all the emotions and everything at the time.
Yeah. So how was it when you finally spoke to somebody? I mean, just in terms of, well, I suppose of letting listeners understand the process. It obviously, it's not you have one therapy session and suddenly you're fine, it's solved. How was that kind of journey, for want of a better word, for you after you'd actually spoken to somebody specifically about this?
So I wasn't formally diagnosed as such, but there was a very quick recognition that I had a lot of symptoms that you would associate it with post-traumatic stress disorder. And just talking it through was emotional. I think the moment that I began to talk about it, it unlocked Pandora's box, and there was this sort of flood of emotion. And once I'd got through the tears and over that, not over that emotion, that's the wrong word, but it was out there on the table. It became something tangible, that was real, rather than something that had just been shut away in my little brain for that length of time. And as soon as it was out there, there was hope, I suppose is the best word, that this is something that I can recover from and manage and understand a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you again. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment. I'm going to bring Steve in here. So as a crewmate, do you think there's anything that you can do to sort of keep an eye out? I mean, Nathan was saying, it probably would have been really difficult for any of his crewmates to pick up on anything because even he hadn't sort of fully processed it yet. But do you think there is something you can keep an eye out? What is the role of, I guess, people who are working together in sort of helping this situation a little bit?
As far as crewmates go, if I could take for what Nathan says here, and from my experience, you almost conceal it from yourself. And if you're capable of concealing the problem from yourself, then you're eminently capable of concealing it from others around you. And it can be really difficult to spot. And it's only when it comes to crisis that perhaps people can see it. So I think in the immediate aftermath, of the job, when you are purely coping with the emotion and you're processing it, then in all likelihood, I'm not sure you would spot it necessarily that easily. I think if you are the crewmate of someone and they've been to a case like that, don't be afraid of just checking in, and you don't want to ask the intimate details and stuff. But, how's things? You're right. Just checking, just making sure that you're a pair of ears that would be receptive to their worries and thoughts. I think we're much better at it now than we were, to a degree. I think I've been knocking around for 28 years, and once upon a time you just had to cope, and that was it. You coped, and I think we're much better at accepting the fact that that's a silly place to exist. And I think as we've become more aware of the fact that the human mind isn't this immutable thing, and it is something that can be damaged very easily, I think society's become much better at recognizing that, and all the better for it, really. I think as a profession, we're much safer now around the way our mental health can be affected by the jobs, the incidents, the patients, than we ever were before. And hopefully it will continue to get better.
Do you think there is a place for the older generation of paramedics? I hate to call you the older generation, but the more senior generation of paramedics, to actually set an example for the youngsters coming in?
Yeah, I think if you don't, you're in danger of breeding the almost of complacency towards mental health, or mental ill health within the service. And so if the likes of Nathan and I, were to bury our heads in the sand and just belligerently carry on and say, you've got to cope, get on with it, then that would breed another generation of ambulance staff that felt the same. I think, people younger than myself are probably more grown up than I am in a degree, in the maturity of which they approach their mental health. I've still got I still struggle to articulate it sometimes, and still struggle to be open with myself about it, let alone others. But I think 10 years ago, I would never come on a podcast and spoken about it. I don't know about you, Nathan.
I completely agree, Steve. And I think is pretty much exactly the rationale for doing this. It's not something that's easy to talk about mental health, but we have to lead by example. I wouldn't want someone else experiencing what I did for that length of time. And as soon as I sought help, things got better, because I think there's this big expectation in our head because of our mentors, our experiences, that we don't openly discuss emotion. And quite often we will use dark humour to cope in order to move on to the next incident, and not actually emotionally discuss how we're feeling after an incident. And it doesn't have to be to the same extreme. Every job has the potential to trigger someone, and it's based on your previous experience and values. And I'd be a big advocate of just, after anything that's had a challenge, we deal with a lot of difficult circumstances, from the elderly that, given our current situation, we're not getting to for lots of hours, and that can have a huge impact because we feel like we're letting people down. There's emotions like guilt. So I'd be a big advocate of just discussing that after each incident, just a little check-in. It takes seconds, because we're talking about the extreme with this incident, but every incident will affect someone in some way. So just being emotionally sensitive. I like that.
Yeah. And this question for either of you, is there a sort of a protocol in place now? Is there a better check-in that isn't just you're all right, you're good, yeah, good, okay, bye?
I think so. I think my experience now is that we have a number of different avenues to seek support, and that's through peer support. What are we calling them now? Peer guardians? I can't remember the exact phrase. Support guardians, that's the one. So we have designated people with additional training and skills. And we also have TRIM. I know that's in the process of being revalidated, where people can go through a evidence-based process to recognise and pick up on risk of trauma.
Is that an acronym, I presume? One of the million NHS acronyms?
Honestly, I was hoping you weren't going to ask, because we use acronyms often.
I've got your back, Nathan. I've got
your
back.
Come on, Steve.
It's a military thing. It's trauma risk management.
There we go.
It was recognised, I think, in the military before we really recognised it, possibly, that people are at extreme risk of harm, having witnessed traumatic events. Trauma risk managers. I think most OOs, operation officers, are trained in TRIM. We've also got mental health first aiders as well in the trust now, who've had additional training. And I think they wouldn't be perhaps the go-to practitioner to fix all your problems, but they've been given training and awareness to notice that there's a problem in the first place, which is probably the bigger part of making sure people get the help they need.
Yeah. So actually that's sort of what I was going to touch on next. Is it does seem that there are sort of people who are going to check in, and obviously you can be sensitive if you're a crewmate, etc. But bearing in mind everyone is affected so differently, and you just don't know what's going to affect people more than others, the onus does seem very much on the individual to seek help and to reach out. Is that generally the case?
Oh, massively so. And I think it always will be. I think no matter what initiative we put in place, that the sort of the initiation of that has to be from the individual. And that's where having these kind of conversations, breaking down barriers and tackling stigma, will enable someone to feel confidently and comfortably that they can seek that help before things develop. And I think that's where we need to invest our time moving forwards, is breaking down barriers and ending stigma.
Yeah, and we'll come on to what some of those might be in a moment. But Steve, just to come back to you, I know you've had a sort of similar but also completely different experience in terms of seeking help yourself. Are you happy to share a little bit of that?
Yeah, sure. So I can remember a number of events across my career which would probably stand out in isolation as being traumatic. But I don't think any one of them individually sort of tipped me into me having a problem and a health issue around it. What I suppose I do find, and I still find, and I probably always will find, is that these cases just come back and revisit me every so often. And I call them my little ghosts, really, that just hang around with me. But I tell them to, do one. And they're gone as quickly as they come. There's these fleeting, intrusive, but I don't personally feel harmfully so. And it's weird. It's from hangings to dead children to a little lovely silver-haired octogenarian saying goodbye to her husband. So they're sort of really are multifactorial in their nature. But I think that is probably one of the risks of doing a job we do to a degree, and maybe it's a risk that I'm happy to tolerate. Or perhaps I wouldn't recommend it in others, but it's a risk I'm happy to tolerate. But mine was, I rather foolishly, it seems in hindsight, but at the time, I thought it was my big career move. Went into a management role, and it's something I didn't enjoy particularly well. And I coped for about 2 years. And interestingly, it was someone actually noticed behaviour changes in myself and told me that perhaps I wasn't as well as I thought I was, or coping as well as I thought it was. So mine was sort of cumulative stress over a couple of years, compounded by being a person in a position of responsibility with a team of people I was responsible for, and not wanting to let anybody down. And you could almost read a textbook on all of those emotions to a degree. And it was my daughter and son. I took them to the Christmas fair up in Exeter, and we were just crossing from the car park into the Cathedral Square, and an ambulance went hooning past, lights and sirens, the whole lot, being superheroes as they all are. And my daughter grabbed my younger son and said, "Look, that's what Daddy used to do." And that was it, really. That was. I suddenly thought, do you know what? You're right. I'm not doing what I want to do and what I feel I should be doing, and I'd lost my identity as a ambulance person and all that sort of stuff. So I suppose I broke at that moment to a degree. However, having said that, the bratwurst and the schnapps helped that night at the Christmas market. But I sought help straight away. Next morning, I rang the Staying Well Service. They got me some talking therapy. Went to see my GP, who immediately wrote me up for some citalopram, which I'm still on, and zopiclone to help me sleep. And then this was, how many years ago was that, Nath? 2-3 years ago? So, something like that. And then
you have to refer to someone else to remember your own sort of.
Well, I don't know. It just years run into one another. And then I'd probably still say that to a degree I'm not 100% fixed, but I'm fixed enough. If that makes sense. I don't know if that makes sense at all. But
no, I think it does. I think that's really important as well. Like we were saying, it's not. There's never going to be an immediate fix, and that's not to make this sound like a really depressing thing. That well, what's the point then? It's expectations that when it's something, particularly in your case, it's cumulative. It's been over years and years and years and years and years. You're never going to find the perfect drug or the perfect therapist that is going to sort it out in a week. It's and it's going to take time.
I think I'll carry it to the grave, but I'm at peace with that. It's I can function. I wouldn't say I'm depressed. The doctor put it very well. I tried to come off citalopram a year or so ago, and she asked me why, and I said, "Well, I just don't feel I need it." And she goes, "Well, if you were diabetic, would you come off insulin? If you had, God forbid, some sort of malignancy, would you stop your chemotherapy if it was curing you?" And I said, "Well, no." And she goes, "Well, why do you feel any different about this?" But in my head, which is interesting, a bit that's wrong, but in my head, I was rationalising it that I didn't need it anymore. That I did. And she goes, "Look, you've got a chemical imbalance. These pills sort it. Don't be so silly. Off you go." And it's probably the best piece of advice I've ever had, actually, from a doctor, other than don't eat yellow snow.
I mean, don't think you need a doctor for that bit of advice, do you?
Well, I got a nasty infection. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that I think is, and I'm going to come to both of you in a moment about the medication element specifically and your experiences as a paramedic and medication in terms of the sort of people you probably are called out to, and therefore the idea you have in your head of what a person who takes medication is like. But Nathan, am I right in thinking you were on medication but short term, so you sort of did it the other way, and that it was sort of a stabilizer, and then you sort of had a slightly different journey?
Yeah, I've only recently come off it, actually. So I was on sertraline, and probably about 3 months ago, I was in a good place. I felt that I was ready, and I spoke with GP and did it. Gradually weaned myself off, and I'm not going to say it was easy. because it had some really difficult moments in that journey. But yeah, I have now stopped taking that medication. And it's only sort of after stopping it, I realised how much I needed it at that time. And it was relatively short term, but it enabled me to function, to put all the other work in that I needed to at the time, because I think without it, I wouldn't have been able to recover, to get better.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really important as well for people listening, just that there is no one size fits all. So, it might be that you stay on the medication for the rest of your life because it's sorting out a chemical imbalance, as you said, Steve, and it's foolish to come off it. And then for other people, it might be that it's a stabilizer for a sort of relatively short time in terms of your, lifespan. And then you can try coming off it, always with an enormous amount of guidance and advice, obviously, and not just suddenly. And yeah, I mean, so to sort of come back to the question I kind of hinted at before, for both of you, and it's so great that you're both so open about this, and particularly, I think, again, it's a generalization, but women do tend to be slightly more forward about talking about the mental health than often men are. Do you think that's fair, and why do you think that is the first question? And in fact, let's just start with that, and then I'll fire the next one at you afterwards, to either of you.
I think it's massively fair. And I know Steve, I look up to Steve, and this is probably the most that we've ever talked about our mental health.
We spent nights alone on Dartmoor together as well. And we've never spoken about it.
Me.
And I think this is the point.
Actually, that isn't fair. I think we both know each other, and I think we both know that when we go up on Dartmoor, that's our little kind of just, it's a laugh, we have fun and all that sort of thing. I think maybe we
can we just clarify what you're doing? Are you camping? What's happening in Dartmoor?
Camping, wild camping.
Okay.
We've got tranches and we cook curries and stuff and go wild camping, look at the stars.
Okay.
There's a group of us do it. But I think maybe we don't talk about it, but maybe we know that we perhaps don't need to, that is our therapy.
Yeah.
Perhaps it's that.
Yeah. I think with men, it's subtext. It's not openly out there. You have to sort of almost read between the lines, because I don't know. It sounds like Steve had a similar upbringing to myself. From a very young age, you're told not to cry, to man up, boys don't cry. And I think, this is where that sort of generation of men not being very emotionally sensitive to their own emotions. So sometimes I think men want to talk about their emotions, but sometimes you just don't know how, because it's not done frequently enough. And there's a huge amount of ego, isn't there? That sort of silverback gorilla, I will protect, defend. I don't want to be seen as weak or vulnerable. And through my journey, I've actually had a huge amount of appreciation for anyone that speaks up and advocates for men's mental health, because they, in my eyes, are the silverback gorilla that are out there to protect other people. So it's just a big shifting, big shift in culture and thought process and understanding. And I think even the last few weeks, there's been media coverage of mixed martial arts fighters, for example, openly talking about men's mental health. Tyson Fury, this idea of masculinity, I think is changing, which I think is positive.
It's maybe one of the last, perhaps not the last taboo, but it feels like it's a persisting taboo that needs to be. I mean, we're much better around sort of thing, gender identity, sexuality. I think we're much more willing perhaps to accept that nowadays, and yet you won't talk about the fact that you have suicidal ideation. Very strange, isn't it? It's very odd. But I agree with Nathan. It's effectively, you are talking about a disease. It's a disease of society that we're not open about it. And unfortunately, it's a disease that continues to take lives, I think, ultimately.
Yeah. And just to return back very briefly to everything around medication, because I think there is, even outside of the ambulance service, it's certainly not unique to paramedics for there to be stigma around taking medication for mental ill health. But what has your experience been as a paramedic, as I mentioned before, in terms of the contact you would often have as a paramedic with people who were on medication?
I'll quite happily admit to, and whether I'll put my head above the parapet a bit here, but it was a period of my career where I've solved mental health problems and citalopram, sertraline, those sort of drugs, as it's just like, what you want those for? Just come on, pull your socks up. And I had that feeling about that sort of. I don't think I sincerely hope I never externalized those emotions and those thoughts. I don't think I ever did, but I certainly used to think, oh, here we go. And it's not. I mean, to be honest, it didn't take me to be on citalopram to realise that was an inaccurate way of thinking. I assume I stopped even considering those emotions or thoughts as even remotely appropriate years ago. But now it's actually, to be honest, I find it easier to deal with people on that medication because you can relate to them. You can say, oh, I'm on that. It's a pain in it every morning having to take that. So it's I find it easier to approach and deal with those patients now. So I feel like I've got a connection with them when perhaps 15 years ago I didn't. Nath?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think I did everything I possibly could to avoid going on medication. I definitely had some huge biases towards it. And I think that is through the exposure that we get in the emergency ambulance service, because we deal with the extremes, those that are at crisis point, or those who have been potentially in and out of services for a number of years. And maybe we see them regularly, which will build up a bias in our head towards that individual. And yes, Steve explains it quite well with the use of a bell curve, that we don't see the majority of people on medication because they're coping and it's working for them. We will just see both extremes.
Yeah, you're right. Is you do see the far end of that Gaussian distribution curve where you see the extreme end, and there are several million, I'm sure, in this country and billion across the world, all on the same medication functioning perfectly well, and no one would ever know.
And it's only since opening up discussions that I've spoke to so many people that are on medication that I had no idea about.
Yeah.
It's having this kind of discussion, I think, that opens people's eyes to it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important takeaway as well, just that it's much more common than people have the perception of it being, because you only really know if something's gone wrong rather than all of the people, as you say, that are functioning so well and so much better than they would otherwise have been whilst on them. Yeah.
It's just such an odd perception, isn't it? If you break your arm, everybody knows. Again, horribly so. If you got a malignancy, if you got cancer, most people would know. If you have a heart attack, most people know. But if you have a mental health problem, you internalize it for some, for fear of failure or for shame or any number of strange emotions you might attach to admitting you're having a problem. So therefore, it's a hidden issue. I think if you honestly surveyed the majority of healthcare staff, most would admit to have been on that medication or had problems at some point that needed some intervention.
Yeah. It's a shame that people think that it's such an outlier or worried because they think someone will find out. In terms of sort of your both of your experiences of counselling as well, because it would be nice to sort of round it off with talking about that. Now, Steve, I think you said did you call the Staying Well service for yours? Because I think, Nathan, you mentioned that you actually referred yourself online. Is that the case? I think it's quite useful for people to know that they can do that and you don't actually have to talk to someone if you really don't want to in the initial first contact.
I don't think I could have spoken to someone initially, because for me, once I'd written it down on paper, I could sort of think it through, and again, this sort of put my perception on it and how I wanted to be perceived, almost, rather than, I think, I couldn't have done that face to face, and it's a nice option. And once it was out there, there's no taking it back as well. And I wrote it all out. And I sat there and I looked at it for a good 5 minutes before pressing that send button. But as soon as I did, it was honestly, it's the best thing I've ever done. Well, not the best. I got married and had children.
No, but you know what? That's a really interesting and important thing that, you know, if you feel able to call, brilliant. But for someone particularly, I imagine that there's an issue of sort of, to a certain extent, controlling how your story comes across that is quite big to begin with. And so you were able to feel like you still had control over your story in the first instance when you passed it to someone else. And then, of course, once you get into the therapeutic process, it's, you know, it's here, there, and everywhere, and you can express it in whichever way. But I think as a first point of contact, that's probably quite a big thing for people to, as you said, control how the story is read and how you come across in the story as a first contact.
Yeah, hugely important. And yeah, just on our intranet pages, you can self-refer through there.
Yeah. How was your sort of reaching out process, Steve? Did you feel comfortable?
Well, I called, and I called because I was scared of what I thought I might be capable of. And I wasn't going to go off the harm of the people or my family, or what I might do to myself, I think. And I can vividly remember crossing a small motorway bridge, footpath bridge down the road from here. Went out for a walk, and I had to walk in the middle of the path because I was genuinely afraid I was going to throw myself over the edge. And a visceral feeling, you know, absolutely visceral, almost tasted like blood in your mouth type feeling. It was, you know, and I thought I've got to get across this bridge. So I got across the bridge. It was on the way home, and I came straight back in and said to Marisa, "Can you take the kids out for a walk? I need to make a phone call." And she knew I was likely to at some point, and I just rung them up and said my head's broken. You know, and then they got me they went up at Red Poppy, look after me in the first instance, and the GP and Zopiclone and what have you. But it was such a intense moment that I thought I need to get help now. And I thought I also, thinking in the back of my head, I thought I need to. By making the phone call, I was forcing myself to admit I had a problem, I think, to a degree as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, it takes an enormous amount of bravery to however you get in touch with someone about it. But I guess as well, sort of the more it's spoken about and the more open people are, the more likely someone may be to reach out before it gets to the point that you're having to walk in the middle of a bridge to make sure you're not too close to the end, you know, and it's, you know, it's amazing that you were able to do that whilst being in that place mentally.
Yeah, weirdly, I still don't. I don't know why. It's probably something I need to figure through. But I still don't think I was that ill. But I think I was. But
no,
I still don't think.
Because actually, thoughts of suicide are not abnormal.
No, I know, absolutely.
It's a normal, rational response, and it's not about ending your life, is it? It's just
ending what's going on.
I don't want this going on anymore, and it seems like that is a possible option. So it doesn't, just because you have a thought of suicide does not mean that you're unwell. It's a normal, rational response to sort of external factors going on.
Yeah, I just think I look back and I don't think it was that incident at all. I just still, compared to others, I feel I was broadly okay, but probably not in hindsight.
Yeah, but we do compare, don't we? This is like social media. Someone else has got more problems or deserves that help more. Yeah. And I think that's.
I don't want to be a burden. Yeah. I don't want to let people down. All of those things.
Coming to a close with the episode, let's end on a positive. Nathan, you're doing a lot in your community around mental wellness, I think, now. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of what you're doing?
Yeah, probably too much, as my wife keeps telling me. But yeah, it's all about balance, isn't it? But yeah, no, I run a hub for a community interest company where we throw ourselves in the sea in a really positive way. So practicing cold water shock therapy. And we try and embed sort of the 5 ways to well-being, that we're connecting people. We have volunteers. and just being in cold water. There's nothing else to worry about, or you're not thinking about how much you have to do at home. It's just taking time out for 20 minutes. So yeah, that's become a big part of my life, and it's also shaping my work. Last week I spent doing a suicide first aid tutor course, which we're not entirely sure what that's going to look like, but there is some training coming out in suicide first aid within the trust. So yeah, it's, although the whole experience was negative, it's about putting a positive spin on it. And I think once you've been through that kind of experience, you want to give a little back, maybe, because it's been there for you as a safety net. So I suppose, there's that obligation that I feel like I need to impart a bit of me into it as well.
Well, that's brilliant. Listen, thank you, Steve and Nathan, for sharing all of that and for talking to one another more than you have done, despite having been friends for however many years that you have.
I don't know who he is.
Who is this person? I think it's gonna be a really helpful episode for a lot of people. So Nathan Wilson, Steve Knowles, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you for listening to the Ambulance Podcast, a series brought to you by SWASFT Ambulance Service Foundation Trust in association with the Drive Project. If you are a clinician and you've been affected by any of the issues discussed today, you can always find help with the Staying Well service. You can also find a variety of links to help and support of all kinds in our accompanying show notes. Until next time, goodbye.